everybody. Welcome to That Expert Show, where you help run the show. I'm Anna Canzano. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. We are talking about college admissions. We're about to get back into the back-to-school season, and this is going to be on the minds of parents of high schoolers as they are starting to think about college and approach that admissions process. I don't know about you, but for me, applying for college was difficult. I mean, my parents had both attended college, but that was in Taiwan. They were both college graduates, but I knew nothing about the admissions process here in the U.S. Thankfully, I had some great mentors, a graduate from Yale, a teacher, who helped me through that process. And I think I remember that part of my admissions package was an actual VHS tape of different videos that showcase the different activities that I was a part of in high school. So kind of unusual. We'll talk a little bit about why an unusual admissions package may actually help you. And we're doing this interview kind of on the heels of that big admissions scandal story, that story that broke about how all those parents of kids were trying to get their children into Ivy League schools and top tier schools by essentially cheating and scheming the system and paying big dollar amounts to get their kids in, even creating fake student athlete profiles. The interesting thing that came out of that, I found, is that there are legitimate and totally legal college consultancy agencies, consultancies like Ivy Coach, which have been quoted in the New York Times. We are joined today by the managing director of Ivy Coach, a graduate of Dartmouth himself, Brian Taylor, joining us live from Manhattan, New York. Brian, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Anna.
So, Brian, let's start off with that. Did that admissions scandal help or hurt your business? And what was your overall take on it now that you've had several months to kind of digest what happened?
I don't know if it helped or hurt. It made people aware of the fact that college consultants exist. I wouldn't wish that college scandal to happen again, or the fact that it did happen. I didn't like that it happened. I didn't like that people were stooping to such unethical means in order to game the system, when this is a system that can be beat fairly and ethically if you just do it the right way.
That's an interesting point. It does speak to the competitive nature of getting into Ivy League schools. And for most people, for many of us, that probably just seems like something that is completely out of reach. Is that the case? And, are great grades enough for your kid to consider attending an Ivy League school?
Harvard's admissions officer has made famous a line that goes something like, we reject 4 times the number of students we admit with perfect grades and perfect scores. That's how many kids they're rejecting, classes worth of kids with perfect grades and perfect scores. It's not just about getting great grades and great scores. It's about making yourself interesting. It's about making yourself singularly talented within your activities. It's about daring admissions officers not to admit someone who's going to change the world in one super specific way. So one of the big things that we do is we figure out what that way can be, and it's often very different from how people would ordinarily present themselves.
We put this question to people out on social media, giving them an opportunity to ask their questions of you. Carrie on Facebook wants to know, and it speaks to what you were just saying, what about kids who are well-rounded but don't excel in any one thing? For example, my son has a 3.6 GPA, has played a sport, done community service, been in drama, etc., but isn't a star athlete or a 4.0 brainiac.
So why is he putting these sports on his college application? If you're not getting recruited to swim, participating in swimming is of no value to highly selective colleges. Of course, it'll get you in great shape, and it's a great thing to do in life. But from a college admission standpoint, it only actually hurts your case for admission. When you can be devoting these hours to an activity that actually serves a college, you have to think, what is the way in which you are serving the college? How are you going to help the college? Because that's all they care about. So, if you're doing sports and you're doing community service, I mean, that's your typical profile. The kid who plays 3 sports, a musical instrument, and works at a homeless shelter. That's cliche. Mm-hmm. And the whole game in college admissions is making yourself not cliche.
So what are the ways in which to make yourself not cliche on the flip side? What are examples
I would ask
of that?
That student, what are they interested in? And I'd figure out, is there an academic subject that interests them? Are they interested in anthropology? Are they interested in psychology? I try and figure out something that they're interested in, and then we can get involved in activities locally. A lot of people think they need to impress admissions officers by doing fancy service trips in Nicaragua. But even if those fancy service trips are free, admissions officers believe, they don't know that they're free. And they think, oh, wow, I'd love to go to Nicaragua, but I make $40,000 a year. I can't afford to go. And now they suddenly resent that applicant, when the whole game is to get these admissions officers, who are human beings, to root for you, to inspire them to root for you. So there's no reason you can't act locally in one specific way. If you're interested in psychology, there's psychology research that you could do locally. You could blog. You could get involved with the American Psychological Association.
That's interesting. So you're saying that like the upper middle class kid that has the opportunities to go travel to some other city or even some other country and, help build a school there, that may actually work against them because the admissions counselor is saying, oh, well, that person has the means to go do that versus somebody who's growing up in the inner city who doesn't have the means to do that and is helping out at the local Boys and Girls Club, 3 times a week.
And the latter kid will win every time over the other kid. Another thing that a lot of affluent students get involved in is they do summer enrichment programs at fancy schools like Penn or Stanford, the summer enrichment programs. And these programs, again, cost between $10,000 and $15,000. And what it says to these schools is mom and dad are, first of all, basically getting them to go to summer camp. So it's not initiative that the student is showing on their own. And it's flaunting wealth again. And then, God forbid, they don't get in early to a school like Stanford or Penn, and they end up applying regular to a school like Cornell. Well, Cornell admissions officers are going to assume that the kid applied early to the Stanford or the Penn and didn't get in, and now they're second fiddle. When I would much prefer these admissions officers at Cornell to think this kid was a procrastinator. They didn't apply anywhere early. They weren't ready to commit, so they applied everywhere regular.
That's fascinating. Okay, so let's talk about that early admissions process because I don't think that I was hip to it X number of years ago when I was applying to colleges. Let's talk about early admissions and the benefits to applying early financially or otherwise.
To not apply early is to waste the most valuable card that you have in your back pocket. You want to apply to a reach school in the early rounds, but not an impossible reach. A lot of students, and particularly their parents, say, I want my daughter to apply to Harvard in the early rounds because I never want to wonder throughout the rest of my life if she could have gotten into Harvard. But I'll tell them during our initial evaluation if you have a shot on God's green earth of getting into Harvard. And if not, I'll pull that Band-Aid right off because I would much rather them hear it from me than hear it from Harvard when they don't get in. Because then, not only will they not get into Harvard, but they won't get into, say, Dartmouth if they applied early. Whereas it's going to be a lot harder to get into Dartmouth in the regular round. So that's why you want to apply to a reach school, but not an impossible reach. Many students are disinclined to apply early because of financial aid. And they want to weigh financial aid offers from the various schools that admit them. And that's ridiculous. You don't have to do that. You can plug your numbers into the net price calculator online, and you can have a good sense of what colleges are going to give you. And then you can apply early. You don't need to wait for these colleges to offer you financial aid.
So as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about ways to get your application to stand out. Like you're saying that you're able to look at an application and immediately tell this family, you pride yourself on telling it like it is, which is what I love. All of your blog posts are like, this is how it is. We're going to rip the Band-Aid off. It's better that you hear it from us than on down the line after you've spent a bunch of money, energy, and time and wasted it on something that you didn't have a chance for anyway, which is so helpful. So then if you were to look at an application through the lens of an admissions counselor, you have former admissions counselors on your staff. What are you looking at exactly? I mean, what makes an application stand out and what sends it to the rejection pile?
Well, if a student has C grades, let's say, as an extreme example, in their junior year coursework, and they're looking to go to Princeton, they're not getting into Princeton. So there's nothing that you can do in your extracurriculars. There's no way you can weave your story to improve your case for admission. And if anyone tells you that you have a shot of getting into Princeton with C grades in junior year, run fast, and run for the hills because you don't. Okay. We can help reasonable people who get into reach schools. Every once in a while we make impossible dreams come true. It usually happens at Stanford because Stanford, unlike the Ivy League, doesn't have an academic index. So they'll often overlook the kid with poor grades because they have such an incredible story. We had a student some years ago who was kicked out from West Point under the then don't ask, don't tell policy. Well, Stanford admissions officers, when they read this story, no matter the student's grades, they were wowed. We want to admit a kid who was kicked out, under the don't ask, don't tell policy to show West Point, that they love him.
Fascinating. Okay. And so when you're talking about not so good grades, so C's eliminate you. B's, A's, like, I got into
if you
Stanford
have
with a
multiple B,
3.87 and a sort of a median 1200 SAT score. Couldn't afford to go, but does
1200
not having
SAT
a
score to Stanford, we would say it's impossible now. How many
okay.
years ago was this? I don't want to age you.
Oh, let's see. It was back in 90, I guess it was 95 that I was applying.
I mean,
94,
unless
95.
you're these days, if you're not a recruited athlete, I mean, and you have a 1200 SAT score, if your dream is Stanford, we'd say Godspeed.
All right, good. I'm glad to know that in retrospect, that's the truth. Okay, so where is the bar then? Can you give us a sense of where the bar is on grades and standardized test scores?
Sure. I mean, if you have a couple of B pluses, can you get into a Stanford? Yeah, it can happen. But remember, they reject classes worth of kids with perfect grades and perfect scores. So we're competing against those kids. We just have to make you more interesting than them by getting you involved in activities that are interesting and making sure that you're taking the right tests. So for instance, Stanford is one of those sneaky schools that often requires students to submit all of their SAT or ACT scores. They actually violate the score choice policy of College Board and ACT. I would argue, by demanding to see all of these scores. So these kids take these tests under the score choice policy thinking they only have to report their best scores, and yet there are some schools that offend this policy, and some of these offenders are, in the past, have been Penn, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, by demanding to see all scores. It's not right that they do that, but they do.
Speaking of scores, let's talk about that adversity score, which has been discussed in large part in the last year because it's new. Can you explain what that adversity score is and how it can help or hurt an applicant?
Well, I can't really explain it because I don't really know what makes up the adversity score, and neither does anybody else. They've released the 3 general categories, the school, the home, and I forget the third, but it's a bogus score. And it's created by College Board to basically gain market share over their chief rival, ACT, as ACT increasingly gains market share. For a student, let's say, from inner city Baltimore, who's up against a kid who happens to go to Exeter, this kid, and he's up against a kid who has a Roman numeral after their name, and 3 generations of their family have also attended Exeter. Well, they're going to have the same school adversity score you're telling me, and one of the components of that school adversity score is how many AP tests does the school have students take? Who makes the AP test? It's College Board. This is a self-serving score that will be in effect at many schools this year, but I don't see it lasting.
And College Board, as a reminder, is a private company, as is the entity that runs ACT. So you think that this adversity score was essentially a marketing ploy to get everybody talking about the SAT a little bit more.
Yeah, for many years, College Board said that the SAT is not a test that could be prepped for. Of course, we all knew that was bogus because students from affluent backgrounds could get great test prep, and they have an advantage over kids who don't. Well, here they're trying to basically manufacture a number to balance the fact that some kids have an advantage in test prep and some kids don't. So they're essentially, it's a confession that the SAT can be prepped for.
That's fascinating. Okay, I'm digesting all of this information because you're coming at me with a lot of stuff. And by the way, we will create a tip sheet based on this episode for people to review the topics and your wisdom that you're offering in this show. I had a question from Angel on Facebook about academic scholarships. I know many of the people that come to Ivy Coach aren't necessarily interested in scholarships because obviously they can afford to hire a college consultant like yourself. Still, Angel wants to know whether a student needs to be involved in school clubs and be part of scholar societies in order to be eligible for academic scholarships, and what sort of criteria are most schools looking for?
Well, I don't know much about scholarships. The Ivy League schools don't offer scholarships. Many times when you're standing in line at the grocery store, a mom will say, my child's got a full ride to Harvard. And you should, a lot of people believe that, but Harvard doesn't offer scholarships. They offer financial aid. It's need-based aid, but they don't offer academic scholarships. So when these parents brag about their children getting scholarship, roll your eyes secretly.
Okay, that's good to know. And I want to go back to the sports talk. You mentioned something about, as far as scholarships go, you can get to a school based on an athletic scholarship or be recruited in a certain sport. We certainly saw that in the admission scandal where there were all these random sports that suddenly kids were supposedly a part of. Can you offer some wisdom on the sports entry path into an Ivy League school or otherwise?
So Ivy League schools don't offer scholarships for athletes either. So it's one reason why some top athletes don't choose Ivy League schools. But for those who do want to showcase their sport from an admission standpoint to improve their odds of admission, and they have to get recruited by the coach. And in many cases, even our athletes don't rely on their sport. And that's because so often, this has happened so many times to students in the past, but right before the early deadline, when most athletes apply during the early round, and right before that deadline, the coach sends them an email that goes something like this: I think you have such great grades and great scores that you might be able to get in on your own. And maybe for a second, the student and parents are excited by that email, like, oh, I have a chance to get in my own. But what you should read between those lines is this coach is not going to give one of his or her slots for you, and that you are not getting recruited, and that your sport no longer helps you. So it's risky to be, what if you're a swimmer and you get injured and now the swim coach isn't interested in you? What if you're a basketball player and you're not tall enough to play in the Ivy League? It's risky, and we don't rely on sports.
You don't rely on sports. And yet I've seen students play and get good at kind of these off-brand sports like crew or, I don't know, maybe lacrosse, so that's more of an upcoming sport. And that's how they find your way in. But what you're saying is you better have a true passion for that sport, because if you're going to devote years to it and bank on that as your opportunity to get recruited by an Ivy League or top tier school, then that's a big risk.
Absolutely. If there are tons of sports, and a lot of these sports that you mentioned, lacrosse, squash, water polo, swimming, these are sports that don't attract tons of underrepresented minorities. These are affluent sports, so many people from fancy boarding schools will play these sports, and those are slots in admissions. They take up seats. I would argue against having these coaches having so many slots, but it is what it is. These coaches have these slots, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So you mentioned that term, underrepresented minority. Who actually qualifies as an underrepresented minority these days?
African American, Latino, Native American, Pacific Islander. Those are your basic underrepresented minorities. Asian Americans are not an underrepresented minority. They're an overrepresented minority who face discrimination in the admissions process. When you're applying as a Taiwanese American, as an example, you're facing discrimination. They're putting you up against every other Taiwanese and Chinese applicant and South Korean applicant who's applying, and they are stereotyping you. And even though colleges don't admit they're stereotyping you, they are. Harvard University is literally on trial. They're waiting their judgment on if they discriminate in the admissions process.
And are you talking about? So I'm curious now from a personal standpoint, because I'm Taiwanese born. I'm a U.S. citizen, but are you talking about just the ethnicity, or are they looking at your where you live, your residency? If I was applying for college right now as someone of Taiwanese descent, as a U.S. citizen, would I face discrimination?
It totally depends on how you present yourself. So a lot of people think these colleges discriminate on the basis of your race. I would argue that they don't. That's the misconception. They don't argue because you are Chinese American or Taiwanese American. It's about you presenting the same or a similar profile as so many other Chinese and Taiwanese applicants, whether they're U.S. citizens or otherwise. And a big part of what we do is we help students present unique profiles. They're not all presenting the same or similar profiles. And as someone who's been doing this for so many years, these applicants overwhelmingly are presenting the same or similar profiles. When you have an Indian American applicant who wants to be a doctor, how many Indian American applicants are you going to admit who wants to be a doctor? You can be a doctor, but that doesn't mean you need to talk about that on your college application, because medicine's not a major. And so you can major in anything when you get to college, and you can do your pre-med courses, but to be another Indian American applicant who does classical Indian dance or plays tennis and wants to be a doctor, it inspires a yawn.
Oh, that is so interesting. Okay. Can you give me some examples of profiles that you have seen or that your company has helped students create that you're really proud of? Like people that you found that were sort of diamonds in the rough and you were able to highlight what was particularly unique about them that led to a successful admissions.
I don't want to do that for fear of breaching their confidentiality, but I'm happy a lot of our veterans, they volunteer we work with a lot of veterans on a pro bono basis, and they volunteer to tell their stories to encourage other veterans to work with us. We had a veteran a couple of cycles ago who was a first generation American and served his country. I mean, elite colleges, first of all, they love veterans. And when you look at Princeton, they just reinstated a couple of years ago the transfer admissions process, and a huge percentage of the few transfer admits that they admitted are veterans. But then they get a first generation applicant. That is a coveted group among colleges. Colleges love to brag in their press releases the percentage of students who will be the first in their families to go to college. And this kid was also happened to be Latino. He had so many things going for him. He was Latino, he was an underrepresented minority in that sense. He was a first generation student. He served his country. But we talked about his love for serving his country with respect to computer science and protecting our nation in terms of cybersecurity, because that's how he wished to continue serving his country after he was done serving it in uniform.
That is great. And what spurred your company's interest in doing pro bono work with veterans?
We were always doing pro bono work. What people were saying, we don't have any money, we need your help, and we would feel guilty, and so we'd want to work with them, or they were, but then we realized that the veterans, well, they can't fool us. They either are veterans or they're not. They can show their proof of that, and they're so appreciative of our work.
Yeah.
And it really, pushes away the people who are just trying to claim that they have no money and pulling on our heartstrings. Whereas these veterans, they're so appreciative of our work. They've served our country, and highly selective colleges covet veterans. Mm-hmm. And a lot of veterans don't realize this. They go to community colleges, or they go to schools that, Podunk University that nobody's heard of. And these kids actually have a shot of getting into the likes of Harvard and Columbia. Columbia has the School of General Studies, which admits so many veterans each year. And these schools love their veterans, and we want to help veterans realize that they can apply and earn admission to these schools, even if they don't have SAT scores, even if they don't have ACT scores, even if they have subpar grades in high school. These admissions officers understand that they've lived and grown as members of the U.S. military.
That is awesome. Can we talk a little bit about college tours? I mean, we have
Sure.
A 16-year-old at home right now, and I know we need to get on this. We need to start doing college tours, or do you have advice when it comes to making those tours and getting the most out of them?
Absolutely. Don't go over the summer, so don't go now. Wait till kids are on campus. You don't want to go to a college. You don't want to earn admission to a college and matriculate only to realize that everyone there has purple hair. And if kids aren't on campus, then how are you going to know? The kids who are on campus over the summer are high schoolers doing those fancy summer enrichment programs, which we're against. So visit anytime then over the summer, or not over Christmas break. A great time is sometimes over the Jewish holidays because kids are still on campus at those times and you have off from school. But every school you want to get into, you must visit. If you don't visit, don't plan on getting in, because these schools, it's a game. All they want to do is beat the other school in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Well, a school's yield indirectly impacts the U.S. News and World Report rankings. So what are the ways that these schools manipulate the rankings? By manipulating their yield, they admit kids who they think will come. They will reject the kid with perfect grades, with perfect scores, with an outstanding personal statement, who in their Why Cornell essay writes, I want to go to Cornell because Ezra Cornell founded it and they offer a great education. Nobody believes you want to go to Cornell because Ezra Cornell founded it and a great liberal arts education that applies to any school in America. So that you cut and pasted that essay. Every specific in that essay needs to be tailored to how you are going to contribute your singular hook to that school, and you need to visit by filling out the card when you do the tour and the info session. That's their only way for sure of knowing that you step foot on their campus.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense. I mean, as we're sitting here talking about, the Ivies and the top tier colleges, why choose an Ivy? Like, why put yourself through the grind of trying to get into an Ivy League college? What value does that actually hold? Because I think of like the Malcolm Gladwells of the world who say that, we're paying too much for education, and in the long run, it's not helping you that much.
Sure. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell's argument has been debunked by a lot of studies in which, mid-career, your salary, your earning potential after going to an Ivy League school is significantly higher than to a school that is less prestigious. And there are equivalents to Ivy League schools like your alma mater, Stanford, like Duke, like MIT. But in terms of, the connections that you build at schools like Ivy League schools, they're unparalleled compared to, there's no comparison.
my alma mater, so I got into Stanford, but I didn't get enough money from them.
Oh,
So I wound up at Pepperdine, which gave me an academic
okay.
scholarship. I fully enjoyed my 4 years in Malibu.
Significantly, we would have really tried to push you to go to Stanford.
Yeah,
But some.
I got that. I got that. I'm fond of the waves education that I got, but I
I'm
see the
sure.
benefits of both. Let's talk about the impact of connections in admissions. Like
Sure.
everybody knows, you get farther in life based on who you know. But how do you get to know those people if they're not already within your circle of acquaintances and friends?
It's not necessary. I mean, we've had so many parents over the years say that, oh, I'm friends with Secretary Clinton. Why don't I have her write a letter? Okay, you have Secretary Clinton write a letter. Does this Secretary Clinton even know your child? Probably not. What do you think that letter is going to say? This is a great student, even if she does submit the letter. And is that going to wow an admissions officer, or is the admissions officer going to be inclined to think, oh, you're trying to impress me, now I like you less? The whole game is to get this admissions officer to want to root for you, and that does not serve that end.
Interesting.
But in terms of connections, they sometimes can help. But I think people think that you need connections in order to get into these schools. You don't. If you needed connections, then why do admissions officers covet these first generation students? Why do they covet underrepresented minorities? Why do they covet veterans? These aren't necessarily the most connected groups.
Let's talk a little bit about, and this is along those connections line then, people who make huge donations to schools and whether that has an impact on their kid getting accepted.
It can. A lot of people in free consultations, people who are not our client, call us and they wonder, like, what amount will make a difference? No, by the way, just as a point of information, those people never become our clients. The people who inquire about making such $1 million donations. I don't know why. Maybe it's because they don't actually have that money and they just want to brag about, the idea of donating to these schools. And the other portion of those people, they think that donating $500,000 or $1 million is going to make all the difference. What is that Harvard admissions officer going to think when your parents, a year before you apply, donate $5 million to the school? They're going to think you're trying to manipulate them, to beat the system. And Harvard, don't get me wrong, they're going to accept every one of those dollars, and they're probably going to send you a handwritten thank you note, probably from the head of their development office. But it's not going to improve your child's case for admission. Is there a magic number in which it will really help? Yes. But even for those people, it's great. Those people often have connections with the school in terms of their legacies, or their grandparents went there. They're not just or people who have no connection whatsoever to a school who donate money right before. They're trying to make some rule changes in which you can't donate right before or within 3 years of your child applying. I think that's ridiculous too, because you don't think people can donate 10 years before their child applies. They can do the math and donate, each year before that. So that's not going to fix anything.
So you mentioned this, and maybe you covered it, but how much does that legacy aspect of the application actually matter? Because I remember that. I remember applying and no one I knew or was related to went to these schools that I was applying to.
It can matter big time. I mean, at a school like Penn, over the last few years, around 25% of early decision admits have been legacies who fill, and early decision admits fill 55% of the seats of the incoming class.
Wow.
So for such a huge percentage of that pool to be the children and grandchildren of Penn alumni, I think that's ridiculous. I think that the legacy admission should end. I understand why legacy admission exists. I mean, part of that pool of legacy applicants are development cases, those very children of major donors. And they need those monies because tuition doesn't cover the full cost of a student's tuition. They depend on development cases. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe it means not admitting 25. Not all those legacies are donors. Maybe it means only giving advantage to the donors. And I realize that's not a perfect solution, but 25% is outlandish. And it's time to end legacy admission. Again, there's a flaw to that though too, because why we would end it just as the children of African American, of Latino, of Asian American kids are coming of age, and finally they're going to benefit from legacy admission. But still, a huge percentage of legacy admits are Caucasian.
When you go to apply as a legacy admit, is there more wiggle room in terms of your test scores and your grades because you have that as part of your application?
You bet, if you apply early. If you're a legacy applicant who does not apply to that school early, your legacy card does not help you. A lot of students apply regular, but colleges are gonna say to themselves, you knew about us all through your childhood. You went to our football games. You wore our Dartmouth sweatshirt, and you didn't apply to us early. You didn't show your love to us. They want to be loved, and that's going to hurt them.
And then my last question for you, second to last question, is how early should kids and parents be thinking about college?
Well, we have people who come to us, hoping to earn admission to kindergarten in New York City. That's ridiculous.
Well, I hear that's competitive too.
It is quite competitive, but we're not interested in helping you. But if you come back to us in 8th grade, we can map out what you should be doing all through high school. We can give you a roadmap. Just because your high school recommends that you take certain courses, it doesn't mean those are the courses that you should be taking. When you come to us later on in the game, we can always help you. It's just there are going to be some things that we're not able to correct. If you didn't take AP tests through high school and you come to us in June of junior year, well, there's no way we can fix that mistake because the last AP tests that colleges will see are in May of junior year. So the earlier you come to us, the more we can correct. And just because a high school doesn't offer something, it doesn't mean you can't take it, not only to stand out from other applicants applying to highly selective colleges, but to stand out from other applicants applying from your own high school.
Just because your high school doesn't offer it, you can still take that somewhere else, you mean? Like at a community college? Or
Exactly. So let's say a kid takes calculus as a junior. They take BC calculus as a junior, which is great. We love that they're taking BC calculus as a junior. Many of our students take BC calculus as a junior, but then they make the mistake of not having math as a senior or taking AP statistics in lieu of math. And AP statistics does not count as math to admissions officers at highly selective colleges. It shows a lack of intellectual curiosity to not continue in that core subject, math. So what you can do is you can take a class online. You can take multivariable calculus and differential equations. You can take it at a community college. It doesn't matter where you take it, but it does matter that you do continue on with your math. Even though you were ahead in the curriculum by some standards, and even if your high school ran out, you can always go beyond. And I wouldn't tell your classmates because that's a way for you to stand out from your classmates.
Keep it a secret. So minimally start having these conversations at 8th grade, but I mean, ideally you have it on your radar even as the kid is entering middle school.
Sure, but don't contact us until 8th grade.
Sounds good. Any last piece of advice that you have for parents and kids?
There's lots of misconceptions about the college admissions process, and a lot of these misconceptions are perpetuated by colleges. So as an example, colleges tell you they're need blind. Well, that they don't factor in your ability to pay when weighing your child's case for admission. Well, then why on the vast majority of college supplements does it ask, do you need financial aid? This is a supplement that admissions officers are privy to. Why are admissions officers who are deciding yes or no privy to this? Why is this not on a separate document that admissions officers can't see? So are colleges need blind? No. I would say the only exception might be Harvard because of the sheer size of their endowment. They have the biggest endowment in all the world. But most schools, they're not telling the truth when they're need blind. When they say they're need aware, that's when they're telling it like it is.
Meaning, don't be afraid to talk about the needs that you have in your application?
No, if in terms of the needing financial aid, do you need financial aid? Yes, no. That's a yes or no question on many college supplements.
Right.
And if you apply for financial aid, it will in many cases hurt your case for admission because they need those tuition dollars.
Oh, interesting.
And if you are applying for financial aid, they want the kids that those coveted groups that we talked about before, underrepresented minorities, first-generation students, those are students who they understand oftentimes need financial aid.
And if you're not in those groups, you better find what it is about you that is unique that could help the college perpetuate
well,
its
you should
status.
do that no matter what.
Yes.
You should do that no matter what your ethnicity is, but you shouldn't be applying for financial aid. And if you don't know if you qualify for financial aid, well, figure it out before you check yes on the application because it will hurt your case for admission, even though admissions officers will tell you the exact opposite of what I just said.
Wow. Okay. Great information. Thank you so much for divulging your wisdom to us. Like I said, we'll be creating a tip sheet based on the information that you shared with us, and we'd love to have you back sometime.
My pleasure. All right. Thanks for having me.
Brian, thank you. And thank you for joining us for this episode of That Expert Show. My mind is reeling from all the information that he shared. So like I said, we'll make a tip sheet for you. We will make it available at thatexpertshow.com. as well as all the previous episodes of the show. You can always connect with us on social media. I'm on Facebook at Anna Canzano, Twitter and Instagram at That Expert Show. And I know it's hard sometimes to catch shows live, so you can always go back and watch them. We have a YouTube channel, That Expert Show. We also kick this back out to you as a podcast on Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. You can listen to us there. Drop me a line if you can, and check out thatexpertshow.com. That's where, again, you can see all the episodes, all the tip sheets, all the resources, bonus materials, if you will, that we provide in addition to this show that we do every Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific time, live. Thanks for all of your input, and thanks for your viewership. Take care. Have a great week. That's signing out from That Expert Show, where you help run the show.